China has deployed fighter jets to a contested island in the South China Sea in a move likely to further escalate tension there. Fox News has learned the jets will go to the same island where China deployed surface-to-air missiles last week. The dramatic escalation comes as Secretary of State John Kerry hosts his Chinese counterpart at the State Department.
Tension in the South China Sea has escalated after China positioned surface-to-air missiles on a disputed island. News of the deployment came as U.S. President Barack Obama met with leaders of Southeast Asian countries, some of which are embroiled in territorial disputes with China. At the summit, Mr. Obama promised to help allies in the region counter China's expanding territorial claims.
I reiterated that the United States will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, and we will support the right of all countries to do the same. We will continue to help our allies and partners strengthen their maritime capabilities.
The gathering was part of Mr. Obama's efforts to counter China's influence in the Asia-Pacific by strengthening U.S. relations with other countries in the region. The weapons were detected on Woody Island, part of the Paracel Islands chain, just east of Vietnam, one of the nations represented at the summit in California. Vietnam claims Woody Islands, as does Taiwan. The island is home to China's only operational large airfield in the South China Sea, according to Chinese media. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said at a regular news briefing on Tuesday, ahead of the news of the missile deployment, that China has the right to defend itself.
中国在属于自己的领土上部署必要的国土防卫设施，是行使国际法赋予的自保权和自卫权。
The U.S. has criticized China's building of artificial islands and facilities in the sea and has tested China's claims by sending warships and planes close to disputed islands that Beijing controls.
In my opinion, China is clearly militarizing the South China Sea, and you'd have to believe in a flat earth to think otherwise. You know, I think China's SSMs, surface-to-surface missiles, surface-to-air missiles on Woody Island, rather. Its radars, new radars on Quarteron Reef over here. The runway, the 10,000-foot runway on Subi Reef over here, and on Fiery Cross Reef and other places. These are actions that are changing, in my opinion, the operational landscape in the South China Sea. I believe that China's actions are provocative, it increases tensions, and it causes the nations in the region to look to the United States as their security partner of choice and away from China.
General, when does China yank North Korea's chain? What is the point at which they really get serious?
I think they've underestimated the danger of KJU at this point. And he is clearly confident in his ability to provocate and control the situation. So I would encourage them to reconsider that at this time. But obviously they still, despite these recent events, appear to be reluctant to take some serious steps, which they certainly could. Those tests that he just conducted in January and February, that they were within his risk tolerance, that he could conduct those, and at some point in the future here, in the next 3 or 4 months, move beyond it, just as he has done in cycle of provocation and relaxation over time, which has been their norm. I do worry about his calculation being wrong at some point, and that's when I state that that's what I worry most about.
China Sea is gradually becoming more dangerous. As we all know, China has rapidly increased its wealth by exporting to other nations. As a result, China's balance of trade has risen sharply and employment has become harder to find in the USA. The Chinese economy is growing much faster than the economies of other emerging nations. Consequently, China's oil consumption is trending upward. Much of its oil comes from the Middle East, but this may change if China secures control of the vast oil and gas resources under the South China Sea. The problem for China is that other nearby countries are claiming ownership of the same region. Some of these nations are competing not just with China, but with each other too. At stake are undeveloped oil resources, perhaps as large as 80% of Saudi Arabia's known reserves, and the natural gas reserves in the region are said to be 5 times those of the USA. To secure these resources for itself, China is using part of its newfound wealth to dramatically expand its military. But this has frightened China's neighbors into spending billions of dollars on weapons of their own. Up to 50% of the world's oil tanker shipments pass through the South China Sea. That is 3 times more tanker traffic than the Suez Canal, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. Thus, any war that breaks out in the South China Sea could adversely affect the entire world economy. China is building new naval ships and submarines faster than any other country in the world.
United States send its newest warships, the littoral combat ship USS Fort Worth, to conduct routine patrols in international waters of the South China Sea within 12 nautical miles of the Spratlys. Its patrol this month is the first time a U.S. combat ship operated in waters around the islands. The Fort Worth has encountered Chinese frigate it followed closely during the patrol. No incident has occurred because U.S. has previously agreed with the Chinese regarding the use of code for unexpected encounters at sea. Those mechanisms is designed to avoid a confrontation between ships or planes that escalates into a broader clash. The captain of the U.S. Navy, Fred Karcher, said the United States would deploy the latest combat equipment and the most powerful in the Asia-Pacific region. He also said that the USS Fort Worth is part of normal military presence in Southeast Asia. He also confirmed that in the future other similar warship will be deployed in the region.
China's Air Force has completed its first drill of jet bombers in Western Pacific airspace. The one-day exercise took place south of Taiwan. The goal to enhance Air Force mobility and combat readiness. An official emphasized that the drill is a routine exercise and is in line with international law. A relatively new strategic bomber was involved in the exercise.
Chinese leaders are fuming after an American Navy destroyer, the USS Lassen, sailed within 12 miles of one of China's disputed artificial islands in the South China Sea.
The troll was a blunt message that the U.S. does not recognize China's territorial claim on these islands. They've been filling in reefs to construct man-made islands since 2013. China said the U.S. is playing a dangerous game.
How far is China willing to go to protect what it sees as its territory?
The Chinese side is willing to resolve the dispute in a peaceful way, Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman Lu Kang said, but if we're forced, we will respond in our own way. New satellite images of the islands reveal what are believed to be airstrips capable of handling military aircraft. Last June, we traveled towards Subi Reef, one of the islands the U.S. ship approached today.
As we get closer, you can see a number of cranes up and down the length of this island. It almost looks like a city in the middle of the sea.
By claiming these islands, China is also claiming its vital shipping lanes and vast oil deposits. But the U.S. is pushing back and warned today's patrols won't be the last in these disputed waters.
U.S. Defense Department photographs showing Secretary Ash Carter and his guest, the Malaysian Defense Minister, aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The nuclear-powered aircraft carrier is on patrol in the South China Sea. And while U.S. officials say the carrier is staying within international waters, the Secretary of Defense had some blunt words, saying, quote, If it's being noted today in a special way, it's because of the tension in this part of the world, mostly arising from disputes over land features in the South China Sea, and most of the activity, he says, over the last year being perpetrated by China. China has criticised the visit to the aircraft carrier and points out its long-held historical claims in the South China Sea do not restrict freedom of navigation. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson says the US is being provocative on purpose.
What we oppose is waving the banner of freedom of navigation to push forward the militarization of the South China Sea and even provoke and threaten other countries' sovereignty and security interests. In this aspect, we hope the relevant actions and intentions of the U.S. can be made more open and transparent.
The visit by the US Secretary of Defense follows a meeting of ASEAN defense ministers in Malaysia, where the failure to agree on a statement regarding the South China Sea was partly blamed on the US. It also follows naval talks between China and the US in Beijing. The US was criticized for conducting what Washington calls freedom of navigation patrols. Those patrols began last week when the USS Lassen missile destroyer purposely crossed within the 12 nautical miles of a reclaimed island in the Juby Reef developed by China. The US has vowed to continue patrols inside territorial waters. It has called on China and others to stop all land reclamation efforts, but has singled out China in its criticism and actions. Beijing, meanwhile, says the US is trying to insert itself into the South China Sea disputes and should not be where it doesn't belong. China's military says it will take all necessary measures to safeguard national security, and Beijing has lodged a formal protest with Washington. It follows a patrol mission by a US Navy warship close to an island claimed by China in the South China Sea. China's Ministry of National Defense has briefed a group of Chinese journalists, among them CCTV's Han Bin.
Tensions are rising even higher. The U.S. warship Lassen sailed into waters of China's Nansha Islands, also known as the Spratly Islands. China calls it a deliberate provocation.
Such action by the U.S. side threatened China's national sovereignty and security, endangered the safety of personnel and facilities on the related islands and the safety of Chinese fishermen's normal operations, and damaged the regional peace and stability. We expressed our resolute opposition and solemn protest.
China has been carrying out construction in some of the reefs and islands, including the Juby Reef, which the USS Lassen sailed close to. The U.S. calls these artificial islands and does not recognize China's territorial rights.
We have said, and we are acting on the basis of saying that we will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law permits.
China takes the reclamation as natural extensions of insular features and says the U.S. is muddying the waters. Many Chinese believe the foray is meant to show U.S. dominance.
Main purpose for the United States to conduct its rebalance to Asia-Pacific is to use South China Sea issue contain China.
China also criticized the U.S. for the militarization of territorial disputes.
We strongly urge the U.S. side to earnestly respect China's national sovereignty and security concerns, properly cope with divergences to follow the principle of no conflict, mutual trust, win-win cooperation, take concrete measures to correct wrongdoings, and prevent such incidents from happening again.
The Chinese authorities say they monitored, followed, and warned the U.S. Navy destroyer that sailed within 12 nautical miles of China's artificial islands in the South China Sea today. China's foreign ministry says the USS Lassen, quote, illegally entered the waters near disputed islands and reefs. In a statement on its website, it strongly urged the U.S. to immediately correct its mistake and not take any dangerous or provocative acts that threatens China's sovereignty and security interests. A U.S. official says the warship sailed in waters surrounding at least one of the land formations claimed by China in the disputed Spratly Islands chains this morning. It planned to stay in the area for a few hours. This is the most serious U.S. challenge to China's territorial claims in the disputed waters to date. Now, Beijing said last month it would never allow any country to violate the waters and airspace around the Spratlys. Now, meanwhile, Japan has said that it's closely coordinating its intelligence with Washington. The Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga says Japan will work with the international community to protect the open, free, and peaceful waters. Now, he adds that the international community shares their concerns over China's actions in the region. Our Shanghai correspondent Valerie Tan tells us how China is likely to respond to this incident.
One military expert I spoke to say it really depends just how far the American warships pushes the 12 nautical mile that forms the coastline of the territory that is claimed by China. He says while the presence of the U.S. warships is absolutely unacceptable by the Chinese authorities, it's unlikely bombs or missiles will be deployed at this point. He says additional patrols might be deployed, but for now China is currently closely watching the situation. He said it's not in China's favor to start a war, for example, or to retaliate aggressively. But remember also earlier this month, another senior Chinese official had said that China will hand a head-on blow to any foreign forces that challenge China's sovereignty in the Spratly. So we just have to wait and see. But tension is definitely high at this point in time.
Our Genevieve Wu takes a look back at what China has been constructing in disputed areas of the South China Sea and what's at stake for the region and all the rival claimants.
Regional tensions have been simmering for some time now over sovereignty rights of the resource-rich South China Sea. And China's rapid construction activities in disputed waters around the Spratly Islands have been straining geopolitical ties. Now, 7 countries or territories lay claim to parts of the South China Sea, namely Brunei, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan and Vietnam. The speed and scale of China's reclamation efforts in disputed areas have alarmed her neighbors. Here's what they've built so far. 7 small islands by piling sand onto reefs, port facilities, military buildings and airstrips. The installations are strategic. They will enable China to strengthen its foothold on the Spratly archipelago, which is more than 800 kilometers away from the Chinese mainland. By building port facilities and landing strips for aircraft, China will be able to sustain sea and air patrols of the area. Analysts say it all boils down to control of billions of dollars of commerce that flow through the waters, as well as access to critical fishing routes and possibly large reserves of oil and gas.
This was not meant as a show of force aimed at China or any other rising power in the region. Instead, the U.S. and the Philippines insist these joint military exercises are only meant to increase cooperation between allies. But while this was going on in the Philippines, the U.S. was involved in a similar exchange with Vietnam. All this while tension with China escalates because of territorial disputes over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. Vietnam and the Philippines accuse China of being increasingly aggressive, and like others in the region, both countries are modernizing their military and depending on the U.S. for help.
The U.S. is very much engaged with all the countries in the region. The main thing about the interrelationship of countries is increased confidence.
The U.S. has had military bases in both Japan and South Korea since the end of World War II. Both countries consider the United States invaluable not just to their own national security, but to regional stability. The U.S. presence is seen as containing both a potentially problematic nuclear arms race and China's emergence as a superpower. But as part of its new strategy, the U.S. will be redistributing its forces across the Asia-Pacific, pulling 9,000 troops from Okinawa and scattering them everywhere from Guam and the other Micronesian islands to Singapore, Australia, and the Philippines.
The Asia-Pacific governments allied with the U.S. find reassurance in its enhanced and more focused presence in the region, but it's an unwelcome one as far as many people are concerned. They find the U.S. military presence intrusive and destabilizing and accuse the superpower of using its allies' weaknesses to pursue its own interests.
But China has increased its military spending and recently held its own military exercises with Russia. It's pictures like these that concern neighboring governments, and they hope to convince people that the U.S. military is necessary to maintain the peace that allows for the region's economic growth. In Manila, protesters gather in front of the Chinese embassy, angry at a recent maritime standoff between Philippine and Chinese ships.
They say they're tired of what they call the arrogance and the aggression of larger militarized states. As the region's governments struggle to maintain the balance of power, it is no longer just the U.S. military that is unwelcome.
An open contest between the United States and China has just broken out in the South China Sea. After months of careful deliberation, weighing all of the risks, the White House authorized the U.S. Navy to send in a guided missile destroyer to waters hard up against one of the artificial islands that China has constructed in the Spratlys chain. Subi Reef, under international law, is not an island. It's a submerged feature. Once a reef, always a reef. It doesn't matter what China has constructed on top of it. And as a submerged reef, it has no rights to the waters around the area. China seems to think it does, although it hasn't spelled out its claims. Nevertheless, in recent months, it's warned off U.S. military aircraft flying in the area. The U.S. takes these issues of freedom of navigation extremely seriously. But this is far more than just a contest over a reef. China lays claim to the entire South China Sea and all the islands, reefs, atolls, and sandbars in the area, and it's pressing those claims assertively against competing claims from a handful of other countries, some of them U.S. friends and allies, including the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. In the end, this is about who will dominate East Asia in the 21st century. The U.S. fears that China wants to push it out of the area, to overturn a U.S.-led order in East Asia that has prevailed since World War II. China, for its part, believes that the U.S. desire for continued dominance is intended to keep China down, to contain it, to prevent it from emerging as a great superpower. It seems as though the United States and China have decided to make a stand on Subi Reef. For both countries, the stakes could not be higher.
如果有任何国家幻想通过搞一些小动作来干扰甚至妨碍阻碍中方在自己的领土上从事这些合情合理合法的活动，那么我还是劝这些国家趁早丢掉这些幻想。事实上，如果有关方面一再在本地区制造紧张，无事生非，最终也许会使中方不得不得出这样的一个结论，那就是可能我们确实有必要加强加快自己的相关能力建设。我奉劝美方不要弄巧成拙。
China, we got a glimpse of the country's fleet of nuclear submarines for the first time. These submarines have participated in multiple training and drills simulating actual combat using domestically designed techniques. The fleet has also set numerous Chinese records. Zhang Yilei takes a closer look.
For the first time in 42 years, China's nuclear submarine fleet has been revealed. The submarines are now taking part in a military drill in China. Equipped with the latest domestic design navigation system, the submarines have achieved a major breakthrough in terms of the distance and depth traveled.
This drill is different to previous ones because there are more warships participating, including destroyers, frigates, supply ships and nuclear submarine. Also, we don't know the whole plan of the drill, so we need to respond quickly and promptly.
And the fleet has made many Chinese records. It fired China's first rocket underwater,